Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Another episode and another case from the United Kingdom. Today you will hear about events from 2003 that took place in the city of Hull. Let me introduce you to the story of Rachel Moran. Rachel Moran was born in 1982 in Ireland, but when she was 6 months old, her entire family moved to England, specifically to Hull. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Wanda and Ray, and as such, she was the apple of their eye. Rachel was a child who never caused trouble. She always did well at school and could boast a good report at the end of each term. From a young age, Rachel was very interested in music and dance. For many years, she enjoyed learning ballet. She was a cheerful girl with many friends, but she preferred spending time with her family. She was a typical homebody who wasn't attracted to exploring other parts of the world. She was happiest in her own home. After finishing secondary school, Rachel started studying at a 6th form college with a focus on IT, but it wasn't what she wanted to do with her life. Therefore, as soon as she finished that school, she began a course to become a cabaret dancer. During this course, she met a boy named Mark, who was a year younger. They started dating and eventually decided to move in together. As I mentioned earlier, Rachel was very close to her family and enjoyed spending time with them. So when she decided to move out, she didn't go far. She and Mark rented a flat about 1.5 kilometers from her family home. This allowed her to visit her family almost every day. At 21, she worked as a cabaret dancer, but her real dream was to become a chef. She also had a side job decorating cakes, but working in a kitchen was her true passion. Towards the end of 2002, Rachel decided to return to school to pursue a course that would help her achieve her dream. At the beginning of 2003, she was set to start a culinary course. She couldn't wait for it to begin. Rachel was very happy in her relationship with Mark. They weren't thinking about having children yet. They were still young and had plenty of time for that decision. Just before Christmas, at the beginning of December, the couple decided to get 2 kittens. As soon as they arrived, the kittens won their hearts, especially Rachel's. She treated the cats like her own children, spending a lot of time with them and doing everything she could to ensure they were never left alone. Rachel felt they were too young to be left for long periods. She and Mark even planned how they would take care of the kittens during the Christmas and New Year holidays. During Christmas, Rachel would stay at home to look after the cats, and on New Year's Eve, Mark would stay in, allowing Rachel to go out and celebrate. Mark didn't mind at all. He didn't have much money at the time and couldn't afford to go to any parties, so he agreed to spend the evening at home. Rachel went out with her brother John to a pub to welcome the new year. After midnight, they continued celebrating for another hour before deciding to head back to their parents' house. Neither of them lived there anymore, but that night they both wanted to stay over. When they arrived at their parents' house, it was already 1:20 a.m., and Rachel's brother felt he needed to go straight to bed. He had drunk quite a bit that night, and the only thing he wanted was sleep. Unlike him, Rachel hadn't drunk much and was happy to spend the time chatting with her mom. At one point, Rachel decided to call her boyfriend to wish him a Happy New Year. She called the landline at their flat, but Mark didn't answer. Then Rachel dialed his mobile number, and after a moment she heard a voice. Not Mark's, but his friend's. There were also sounds in the background indicating they were at a party. Mark explained that while he was sitting alone at home, his friend had called, inviting him to a New Year's Eve party at his house. They had agreed that he would stay and look after the cats, but he thought it wouldn't matter if he left them for a few hours. However, Rachel didn't see it that way. She was furious with Mark for going against their agreement. She felt she had to return to her kittens immediately. Without much thought, she began to get ready to leave. Wanda was against it. It was already very late, nearly 2 a.m., and the weather was awful. She couldn't drive her daughter because she had had a few drinks earlier. There was also no chance of getting a taxi, as it was one of the busiest nights of the year for taxi drivers. It was unlikely any driver would bother with a short 1.5 kilometer fare. Rachel was determined to go home regardless of the time and weather. It wasn't that far. She would be back at her flat in 20 minutes. Her mother tried to persuade her to stay, but no argument convinced Rachel. As the women talked outside, Wanda even considered asking a passing man to accompany her daughter home, but she dismissed the idea. She thought it would be odd since she didn't know him. So, she could only watch as her youngest child, dressed in a purple dress, walked off towards her home. Wanda called out to Rachel to phone her as soon as she got there, but half an hour later, Wanda was still waiting for Rachel's call. Impatient, she dialed Rachel's mobile, but there was no answer. She tried the landline too, but again, no response. She kept trying these numbers for the next 2 hours before concluding there was no point in continuing. If Rachel wasn't answering, she might have gone to the friend's house where Mark was. Feeling tired, Wanda went to bed. When the phone rang in the morning, she immediately thought it was Rachel. However, it was her other daughter calling to wish everyone a Happy New Year. When her husband and son woke up, Wanda told them what had happened during the night and that she couldn't reach Rachel. They all started calling both the landline and the mobile, but still, no one answered. Finally, after some time, Mark answered the phone at Rachel's flat. He was surprised that everyone was looking for his girlfriend because she was supposed to spend the night with her parents. She wasn't at their flat, and there was no sign she had been there during the night. The flat looked exactly as Mark had left it, with no one having slept in the bed and the cats unfed. Clearly, Rachel hadn't made it home. This behavior was so unlike Rachel that Wanda immediately decided to go to the police to report her missing. Rachel was 21 at the time, but despite this, the police took the case seriously and began investigating right away. Wanda and Ray knew their daughter well and were certain that Rachel would have contacted them no matter where she was. Something bad must have happened to prevent her from doing so. 40 officers were assigned to the case, and the first step was to interview those closest to Rachel, her parents, brother, and Mark. Rachel's mother mentioned the man who had walked past their house while she was talking to Rachel. Since he might have seen something that could help the police, they decided to find him. As the police questioned Rachel's boyfriend, they began to notice his strange behavior. It seemed odd that he didn't appear to be worried about his missing girlfriend. He was the only one who had argued with her that night. Perhaps they had continued to argue when she returned home, leading to something he was trying to hide. The investigators decided to keep an eye on Mark, but he didn't do anything suspicious. They also interviewed the people who had attended the same party as Mark on New Year's Eve. They confirmed that he had been with them the entire time until 6 a.m. There was no evidence to suggest that he was involved in Rachel's disappearance. The investigators had to continue searching for Rachel. For a moment, they considered that Rachel might have wanted to start a new life. They checked her bank account, but no money had been withdrawn, and her debit card hadn't been used. Her mobile phone was last used on the 31st of December. From Rachel's family accounts, it was evident that she was genuinely content. She had a boyfriend she lived with, plans to commence studies at a culinary school, and of course, 2 cats, who were her world. There was no basis to believe she might have run away to start afresh. On the 1.5-kilometer route between her parents' home and hers, something must have occurred. But what? To ascertain this, the police began gathering data from CCTV, both municipal surveillance and cameras situated at shops or private properties. They endeavored to reach every possible camera within a 6-kilometer radius. In footage from a nearby store, Rachel was spotted, allowing the investigators to track her movements and direction. They continued scrutinizing subsequent footage while scouring the streets and their surroundings. On January 11th, while searching a nearby canal, divers retrieved an item that could belong to her. They found a shoe, precisely the one Rachel wore that night. Diving in the canal posed challenges due to its pollution from disposed waste. Nevertheless, the following day, they recovered a black bag containing a woman's handbag. Unlike the shoe, which might have belonged to someone else, there was no doubt about the handbag. Inside, along with cosmetics and other items typical of a woman's handbag, was Rachel's phone, and more importantly, her passport. Those involved in the investigation immediately concluded that they should continue searching the canal. Perhaps Rachel's body lay within it. However, further searches proved fruitless. The investigators were certain Rachel was deceased. Their focus shifted to locating her remains. They then decided to reconstruct events to jog the memories of potential witnesses who might have seen Rachel that night. Female police officer dressed in the same clothes as Rachel and walked along the path that the police thought Rachel used to go home. This reconstruction prompted several new witnesses to come forward. However, each admitted to not being entirely sober that night. Returning from New Year's Eve celebrations, they had consumed alcohol, rendering them unreliable witnesses. Finding a solid lead proved challenging, so they continued reviewing CCTV footage. At one point, they stumbled upon footage from a nearby school, just 150 meters from Rachel's residence. They suspected Rachel was visible in the footage. However, the poor quality and the considerable distance the person was from the camera, along with the shadowy environment, made the figure appear more like a dot. Nevertheless, the police were convinced it could be her. Few individuals traversed that route at that hour. Thanks to this footage, it emerged that Rachel took a different route home than initially assumed. Investigators had believed she walked along a well-lit path, but she had opted for a slightly shorter, less illuminated route. More crucially, the footage revealed another person walking a few meters behind Rachel. This person could be her assailant. If indeed true, and if the assailant was on foot, as indicated by the footage, according to statistics, Rachel's body should be found within a 1.5-kilometer radius from where she was last seen. Since streets, parks, and the canal in the vicinity had already been searched, the investigators made a startling decision. They opted to search every house in the area. Lacking warrants, they depended on homeowners' consent to search every nook, including garages, attics, and even refrigerators. It was a risky decision, but according to the investigators, it was the only way to solve Rachel's disappearance. The operation commenced on January 28th. The police had to visit hundreds of homes and flats. About 100 officers were assigned to this task, in teams of 3 comprising 2 officers and a specialist in search operations, going door to door asking for permission to enter. Not everyone was willing to help the police. Some didn't open their doors at all, while others, though opening them, rudely turned them away. The officers slowly began to doubt whether it was indeed a good idea, but they didn't stop knocking on more doors. It was already afternoon when they reached another house, not far from Rachel's flat. In this house lived 22-year-old Michael Little, an unemployed young man. He had no objections to the police entering his home. Inside, apart from Michael, was his friend Mark Fuller. The house was in a terrible state, full of rubbish, as if it hadn't been cleaned for months. But apart from that, the officers found nothing that would help in Rachel's case. They were about to leave his house when they asked for the keys to the cupboard, the last room they hadn't checked yet. It was a small cupboard, 90 by 90 centimeters, accessed from the outside, typically used by residents to store bins. Michael started explaining that he didn't have the key. He had lost it some time ago. However, the officers had to check every room in the house, so they insisted he try to find it. Then Michael remembered that it might be in his mother's flat. And since the officers weren't planning to leave until they saw what was inside, Michael had no choice but to bring the key. When the door to the cupboard was opened, the first thing visible was scraps of carpet, some boxes, and rubbish bags. Considering that Michael didn't want them to look inside for some reason, the officers started removing everything. And after a moment, one officer who was closer to the cupboard stood still. When the other approached, he noticed what had caused his colleague to react that way. A leg was protruding from one of the rubbish bags. It was Rachel's body, kept in that cupboard for 4 weeks, barely 400 meters from her flat. Both men in the flat were arrested. The officers didn't want them to be taken from the house in the same police car, so they first transported Mark, while Michael waited in his house in the company of one of the officers. And as they waited for the arrival of the police car, Michael began to speak. From his words, it was evident that he felt immense relief that Rachel's body had been found. He had heard that such an action would be taken and hoped that someone would knock on his door and find her body. Holding onto that secret weighed heavily on him. He hadn't told anyone before about what he had done, and he felt he had to tell someone, that he had to get it off his chest. He also admitted that he must be a bad person, since he was capable of doing something so terrible. And then He began to tell the officer what had happened on that fateful night. He noticed Rachel walking down the street and approached her. They started talking, and then Michael invited her to his flat for a drink. She accepted his invitation, and at first they talked for a while, but after a while the conversation turned into an argument. Michael left the room, and when he returned, he noticed that Rachel was holding a knife. She scratched him lightly on the arm with it, and then he snatched it from her hand and, acting in self-defense, struck her. The statement was written down by the officer, and later Michael signed it as true. But what do we know about Michael Little? Since childhood, he had been overweight, which made his life at school difficult. His peers constantly make fun of him or ridicule him. In general, he didn't have a childhood to remember fondly. His father left the family when Michael was still a child. His mother later got involved with another man, but Michael could often feel his heavy hand. When he moved out of his family home, he moved into a council flat, which he didn't clean too often. He didn't bother himself with such details. He had more interesting things to do. His main activities included watching adult films, playing computer games, and experimenting with various substances. He also liked drawing, especially with a pencil. None of his acquaintances recalled him ever being involved with a woman. He told them he was in a relationship with someone and described the woman as quite tall, over 1 meter 80 centimeters in height, blonde. No one, however, had ever seen this woman in person, so his friends regarded her as a product of Michael's vivid imagination. What's chilling is that the description of this girl matched Rachel's exactly. Michael could have observed her before. They lived close to each other, and every time Rachel walked to or from her parents' place, she passed by Michael's house. When the pathologists examined Rachel's body, what they found didn't quite align with Michael's statements. Rachel had 27 wounds on her body, all of them inflicted from behind, which didn't quite fit the self-defense narrative. There were also no signs of struggle found on her. Moreover, Rachel had undoubtedly been subjected to sexual assault, but considering the condition of her body, they couldn't determine whether it occurred before or after her death. Nothing matched the account provided by the 22-year-old. There were also no traces found on his body to confirm that Rachel had injured him in the arm. There was nothing on him indicating that he was telling the truth. Investigators tried to determine how Michael spent the evening before encountering Rachel on his way. He went out with his friends for a New Year's Eve party. He tried to approach one of the women he had been interested in for a while. Unfortunately, he got rejected, and that woman spent the evening with one of his friends. This situation angered Michael, and after a while, he decided to head back home. He was returning home along the path that passed by Rachel's parents' house. Considering the time he decided to return home, the investigators concluded that he was the person whom Rachel's mother saw passing by her house and whom she wanted to ask to escort Rachel home. He was the witness the investigators had been looking for. He probably overheard the conversation between Wanda and her daughter and was aware that Rachel would walk home alone. The recording from the store confirmed the investigators' assumptions, the first recording where they managed to see Rachel clearly. Michael Little walked the same path 3 minutes before her. He must have hidden somewhere to wait for her to bid farewell to her mother and reach the spot where he was, because in the school recordings Michael is already visible, walking behind Rachel. The trial in this case began in October 2003. To everyone's surprise, Michael Little did not admit to the crime before the court. He then completely changed his testimony. He stated that it was his friend Mark Fuller who took Rachel's life. Michael spent New Year's Eve away from home, and when he returned, Mark was in his apartment with Rachel. After a while, there was a closeness between her and Michael, during which Mark entered the room. He became very agitated when he saw the two of them in bed, ran to the kitchen for a knife, and when he returned, he struck Rachel multiple times with it. When Rachel was no longer alive, he forced Michael to hide the body, threatening him the whole time that if he didn't do as he was told, the same fate would befall him as Rachel. He also forbade him from saying anything to the police. If he uttered a word, neither he nor his family would be safe. However, Mark Fuller had an alibi for that night. He was at a party, and immediately after went to his mother's house. Rachel's family also didn't believe in this version of events. Rachel was happy in her relationship, and she was shy towards people she didn't know. She would never go to the house of someone she had met just a few minutes earlier. No one believed in the new version of events presented by Michael. According to all the evidence gathered by the investigators, they could assume that Michael, passing by Rachel's house, overheard her conversation with her mother and thought it would be an opportunity for him to meet the woman he liked. Rachel, in a hurry to get home where her cats were, probably didn't want to talk to him, which angered him. He must have somehow lured her into his apartment, as mud stains were found on Rachel's legs, and then he took her life in the corridor, where traces of her blood were found. The jurors found him guilty of Rachel's murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He can apply for early release only after spending 25 years in prison. Rachel's father believes that being in prison is not a punishment for him, because he has it better there than he did at home. He receives a warm meal every day, has access to the gym, and can also attend free training sessions. He lives there peacefully, and no one will give them back their beloved daughter's life. All they have left is to visit her grave. Thank you for listening until the end. Goodbye. Take care.